Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
The few people that had a positive test at that point, there wasn't a correlation that there were more positive tests in their relatives and contacts. So I think this is one of the biggest points, is if someone isn't sick, fever, coughing, sneezing, those type of things, they're not spreading COVID.
When it comes to the coronavirus, the polymerase chain reaction test, aka the PCR test, is very much in the news these days, especially if you plan on traveling internationally via air. But what exactly is the PCR test, and more importantly, how accurate is it? To provide answers to these questions and more is my guest, veteran doctor Mark Trozzi. Well, Dr. Trozzi, thank you so much for coming in all the way to Toronto and joining me. And I should point out to our viewers, this is the second time I've met Dr. Trozzi. Way back in May, I did an interview with him. You might recall that. We had to disguise his voice and his image because he wouldn't get any professional repercussions directed his way. And so maybe before we get into the PCR test, Dr. Trozzi, why are you now coming forward on the record with your concerns?
Well, I just think that the risk of what's happening to all of us, I mean, whether people are believing the propaganda or not, we're all the victims here. You know, we're dealing with really crimes against humanity and we're all being abused. And at some point, people have to take risks. I have an uncle who had to get on a boat and go to Europe and get off a ship with a rifle. You know, that was risky. I don't think this is that risky. But at some point, you know, higher laws, telling the truth, being open, being honest, I think I think that trumps everything, and I'll have to hope for the best.
Well, bravo for your bravery, and I'm very hopeful that there's no repercussions against your career. And we should stress, too, a very quick background check for you. You're not some crank off the street. You are a medical doctor. You've been in practice for more than 30 years, I take it?
Yeah, so I graduated in 1990 from the University of Western Ontario. I've been practicing predominantly emergency medicine for over 25 years now. I'm an advanced trauma life support instructor with the College of Surgeons of America. I hold teaching positions at Sunnybrook as well as the University of Ottawa and Queen's University. So I do know certainly enough to talk about colds.
I would hope so. Well, doctor, let's get right to the heart of the matter, because we're going to talk about two other subjects. They'll be all separate interviews. The PCR test, what is the issue?
Okay, so the PCR test is the polymerase chain reaction. And as it says, it's a chain reaction which is duplicating genetic material. So when people get the swab, then in the reactor, the chain reactor, one cycle of the PCR test, one cycle will double genetic material that's there. Another cycle will double it again. A third cycle doubles it again. So you have a logarithmic curve where it starts slow. 1 becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2000. It goes very steep, that curve, the more cycles that you do. Now, this was never designed as a test. This is a neat scientific trick. The designer of this trick, who won a Nobel Prize for it approximately 30 years ago, he said this is not to be used as a diagnostic test.
Yes.
In any event.
By the way, and if that is the case, Dr. Trozzi, why is it being used as a diagnostic test?
Well, it's a very manipulatable test, or once you decide to call it a test, because depending on how many cycles you run is going to determine. Now, let's keep in mind, this does not demonstrate that you have intact virus in your nose. What it detects is that they've picked up a fragment of genetic material of perhaps a coronavirus, which is one of the main families that causes the common cold, coronaviruses and rhinoviruses.
As opposed to the COVID-19 type.
Yeah. So in any event, if it picks up a fragment of this genetic material or this RNA, And if you run enough cycles, you get everybody positive, right? So like running more than 20 cycles becomes really quite ridiculous. Well, most labs are running 40, 45 cycles.
Wow. So basically the bottom line is that there must be a huge percentage of false positives out there from what you're saying.
Yes, and you can adjust the number of false positives depending on the cycles. Case in point, when Joe Biden was appointed as president at the beginning of this year, the World Health Organization came out within hours and said, we should run 20 cycles. Well, what would the impact of that be? I think it would create the appearance that Joe Biden cured COVID. Because suddenly you run 20 cycles instead of 40 and you get less false positives.
It's very interesting because we're told that all the decisions are based on medicine. They're based on science. But you're saying there could be, in some cases, political meddling involved in terms of something like the PCR test.
I think clearly. Yeah.
So this information is out there. Here we're having it verified by a veteran medical doctor such as yourself, Dr. Trozzi. So why are we going through this charade? If everything about this PCR test is true, about the number of cycles causing all these false positives, what's the point?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, if you look at death statistics around the world, you don't find that more people started dying when COVID began. So, and that doesn't make sense, because if you have a new cause of death causing new deaths, the deaths should go up. What you find is deaths have been shifted into the COVID department. So someone has a heart attack and a positive nose swab, COVID death, right? So what's the purpose? If it's not to save lives, really.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that everybody's in on it, because I think we're all being abused. This includes doctors, nurses.
Yeah.
I think so many people are being misled here. You know, and fear is a great motivator, right? But if it's not really for our health, then what is it for?
And Dr. Trozzi, one last question. I've always said that the only stat that is meaningful to me is the death stat. And we know, I think the last figure I saw, 83% of COVID deaths in Canada were seniors in long-term care facilities, which is a staggering number. Here in Ontario, 2 people under 20 have died, and both of them had severe medical complications. And yet you saw this, I guess, fear-mongering, especially in the media. Oh, today, such and such a region, 719 positive cases, 1,017 positive cases, and so on and so forth, when in fact, the vast majority recover, and from what you're saying, a lot of these are false positives to begin with.
Well, exactly. And look at the study involving 9.5 million people in a study in Wuhan itself, right? The place where this was released, where this started. And what that study showed, this was about 6 to 8 weeks after they ended their lockdown theater. And what this study showed is, A, there were very few positive tests, but also what you find is having a positive test doesn't mean someone is sick with COVID. And what they even found is there was no correlation. If the few people that had a positive test at that point, there wasn't a correlation that there were more positive tests in their relatives and contacts. So I think this is one of the biggest points, is if someone isn't sick, fever, coughing, sneezing, those type of things, they're not spreading COVID. And then when you look at the PCR test and how that can be ramped up, right? We're hearing this all the time. There's more cases. Where?
Incredible. Well, Dr. Trozzi, I want to thank you for coming in. I want to thank you again for your bravery, because there is an establishment out there that doesn't like contrarian views. And what can I say, folks? We've been having air travelers come into 4 international airports in Canada, and they're getting this PCR test and swab jammed up their nose, and apparently it might not be for any good reason. Fancy that. If you have had your charter rights trampled on in the name of the Wuhan virus, please reach out to us at fightthefines.com. That's fightthefines.com. Let us know about your case. If we think it has merit, we'll get you in touch with a top-notch criminal lawyer and we shall crowdfund your legal fees.